What if the thing causing your suffering is not the problem? What if your anxiety is not the enemy? What if your depression is not the illness? What if the symptoms you've spent years trying to eliminate are actually trying to tell you something important? If you've ever felt anxious without knowing why, if you've ever felt depressed despite having a seemingly good life, if you've ever wondered why you keep repeating the same painful patterns in relationships, work or family, then this video is for you. Because maybe you've been looking at the symptom while missing the story. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some of the most influential psychiatrists of the 20th century believed that symptoms were not random malfunctions, but meaningful communications. You'll understand how modern psychiatry shifted from understanding people to classifying symptoms. And you'll begin asking a question that could completely change how you view emotional suffering. What if the symptom isn't the problem? What if the symptom is the message? Imagine driving your car down the highway. Suddenly, a warning light appears on the dashboard. You immediately become concerned. Something is wrong. So you take the car to a mechanic. The mechanic studies the warning light carefully. He measures it, categorizes it, writes detailed notes about it, develops increasingly sophisticated ways to describe it, and then sends you home without ever opening the hood. Most of us would find this ridiculous, because we understand something intuitively. The warning light is not the problem. The warning light is pointing toward the problem. The warning light is information, a message, a signal. And yet, when it comes to emotional suffering, many of us unconsciously do the exact opposite. We become obsessed with the symptom while forgetting to ask why it appeared in the first place. We become experts at naming suffering, but beginners at understanding it. And perhaps nowhere is this more visible than in modern mental health. Today, millions of people can identify anxiety, depression, ADHD, OCD, PTSD, bipolar disorder, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and dozens of other diagnostic categories. We have become very skilled at naming symptoms. But have we become equally skilled at understanding people? That is a much more difficult question, and it takes us back to a fascinating moment in the history of psychiatry. Before psychiatry became heavily focused on symptom checklists and diagnostic categories, many clinicians approached suffering differently. They asked different questions. Instead of asking, "What diagnosis does this person have?" they often asked, "What happened to this person?" Or even deeper, "What is this symptom trying to communicate?" One of the most influential psychiatrists of the 20th century was Karl Menninger. Menninger viewed psychological suffering through a very different lens than many modern approaches. He believed that many forms of mental illness could be understood as difficulties adapting to life's challenges. Not separate diseases in the same way pneumonia and diabetes are separate diseases, but different expressions of human struggle. Different ways people attempt to cope with overwhelming experiences. Different forms of adaptation, some more successful than others, some more painful than others, but meaningful nonetheless. This idea changes everything, because if symptoms are meaningful, then our relationship with suffering changes completely. Imagine a woman named Sarah. Sarah develops severe panic attacks at age 38. One moment she feels fine, the next moment her heart races. Her chest tightens, she struggles to breathe, she becomes terrified, she feels like she is dying. Naturally, she wants the panic attacks to stop. Who wouldn't? But imagine we become curious. Not just about the symptom, but about the person. Why now? Why not 10 years ago? Why not 5 years ago? Why now? As Sarah tells her story, we discover something important. For 20 years, she has ignored her own needs. She takes care of everyone, her children, her husband, her parents, her co-workers, everyone except herself. She avoids conflict, suppresses emotions, never asks for help, never says no, never rests, and eventually something inside her reaches its limit. The panic attack may not simply be a malfunction. It may be the psyche's final attempt to say, "You cannot keep living like this." The symptom suddenly becomes more than a symptom. It becomes communication. And perhaps this is one of the great forgotten ideas in psychology. Symptoms often make sense once you understand the person experiencing them. The problem is that understanding a person takes time. It requires listening. It requires curiosity. It requires context. And context is difficult to measure. This is where the story becomes fascinating. In the late 20th century, psychiatry underwent a major transformation. The publication of DSM-3 fundamentally changed how mental illness was conceptualized and diagnosed. The goal was understandable. Researchers wanted reliability. Scientists wanted standardization. Insurance companies wanted categories. Governments wanted measurable definitions. Mental health professionals wanted consistency. And on many levels, this was a remarkable achievement. Psychiatry became more organized, research accelerated, communication improved, diagnostic reliability increased, mental health became easier to study scientifically. These were real advances. But every solution creates new problems. Every gain comes with a cost. And perhaps the hidden cost was this. The diagnosis gradually became more important than the story. The checklist became more important than the context. The category became more important than the person. The question shifted. Instead of asking, what is behind the symptom? We increasingly asked, what diagnosis fits these symptoms? Now imagine a man named Michael. Michael walks into a clinic. He feels exhausted, hopeless, disconnected, unmotivated, unable to enjoy life. He receives a diagnosis of depression. The diagnosis may be accurate. The symptoms certainly fit. But what if we stop there? What if we never ask how Michael arrived at this point? What if we never learn that he spent 30 years chasing success while abandoning every part of himself that felt alive? What if we never learn that he worked 80-hour weeks for decades because he believed achievement was the only way to earn love? What if we never learn that he has not felt emotionally connected to another human being in years? What if we never learn that he has spent his entire life running from feelings he was never taught how to process? The diagnosis explains the symptom, but it doesn't explain the person. And perhaps that distinction matters more than we realize. Because human beings are not collections of symptoms. Human beings are stories. Stories unfolding across decades, stories shaped by childhood, relationships, losses, dreams, failures, traumas, cultures, families. And every symptom exists within a story. Think about anxiety. Modern society often treats anxiety as though it appeared from nowhere. But anxiety frequently emerges in meaningful contexts. The college student terrified of disappointing her parents. The father overwhelmed by financial pressure. The entrepreneur whose self-worth depends entirely on success. The child who grew up in an unpredictable household. The symptom may look similar, but the meaning may be completely different. And meaning matters. Meaning always matters. Imagine a teenager constantly arguing with his parents. Everyone focuses on the behavior, the anger, the attitude, the defiance. But beneath the anger lives something else. The parents divorced 2 years ago. Nobody talked about it. Nobody helped him process it. Nobody taught him how to express grief. So sadness transformed into anger. The symptom changed. The pain remained. Again, we are confronted by the same question. What is behind the symptom? Because the visible symptom is often only the tip of the iceberg. The deeper conflict remains hidden beneath the surface. This idea appears throughout psychology, philosophy, literature, and even spiritual traditions. Human beings often communicate indirectly. We don't always know how to express what hurts. Sometimes sadness becomes anger. Sometimes fear becomes control. Sometimes loneliness becomes addiction. Sometimes insecurity becomes perfectionism. Sometimes shame becomes arrogance. The symptom becomes symbolic, a visible expression of an invisible struggle. And perhaps this is why so many people feel misunderstood. Imagine telling someone, "I feel empty," and hearing, "That sounds like depression." Imagine saying, "I feel trapped in my life," and hearing, "That sounds like anxiety." Imagine saying, "My marriage is falling apart. I hate my job. I feel disconnected from my children. I have no sense of purpose. I haven't cried in 10 years. And hearing, "Here is your diagnosis." The diagnosis may not be wrong, but it may not be enough. Because sometimes people don't just want symptom relief. Sometimes they want understanding. They want someone to ask, "What happened? What hurts? What are you carrying? What does this suffering mean?" And perhaps meaning is where healing begins. Now, before going further, it is important to acknowledge something. Modern psychiatry has helped countless people. Antipsychotic medications have transformed the treatment of psychosis. Mood stabilizers have saved lives in bipolar disorder. Antidepressants help many individuals suffering from severe depression. Psychiatric medications can be life-changing. This is not an argument against psychiatry. It is an argument for remembering the person behind the diagnosis, because even when medication helps, the story still matters. The context still matters. The meaning still matters. A pill may reduce suffering, but it may not explain it. And human beings naturally seek explanations. We want to understand ourselves. We want to understand why we suffer. We want to understand why our lives unfold the way they do. And perhaps this is where therapy becomes so valuable. Not because therapists possess magical answers, but because good therapy creates space for curiosity. A space where symptoms are not merely eliminated, they are explored, examined, understood. A space where the question shifts from, "How do I get rid of this feeling?" to, "Why is this feeling here?" That question changes everything. Why is this anxiety here? Why is this sadness here? Why does this relationship keep repeating itself? Why do I keep sabotaging myself? Why do I feel empty even when everything looks successful from the outside? These are not diagnostic questions. These are human questions. And human questions often lead to human answers. The more we explore suffering, the more we realize that symptoms rarely exist in isolation. They exist within lives shaped by circumstances, families, cultures, economics, relationships, childhood experiences, traumas, losses, dreams deferred, needs unmet. And when we begin seeing symptoms in context, something remarkable happens. Compassion appears. Not only compassion for others, compassion for ourselves, because many people secretly believe their suffering means they are defective, broken, weak, flawed. But what if suffering sometimes makes perfect sense? What if your anxiety is understandable? What if your depression is understandable? What if your emotional struggles are understandable? Not desirable, not pleasant, but understandable. That realization alone can feel liberating. because suddenly suffering becomes less mysterious, less shameful, less isolating. And perhaps this brings us to the deepest realization of all. Maybe the goal is not simply to silence symptoms. Maybe the goal is to listen to them. Not forever, not romantically, not at the expense of treatment, but long enough to understand what they are trying to communicate. Because every symptom asks a question. Every symptom tells a story. Every symptom points towards something. And healing may begin the moment we become curious enough to listen. So the next time anxiety appears, the next time sadness arrives, the next time you find yourself struggling emotionally, pause for a moment and ask a different question. Not merely, how do I make this go away? But, what is this trying to tell me? Because perhaps symptoms are not simply problems to eliminate. Perhaps they are messages waiting to be understood. And perhaps the greatest mistake we can make is confusing the warning light for the engine itself. The symptom is visible. The story is hidden. And true healing often begins when we finally become interested in the story. Thank you for watching. Please comment, share and subscribe for more.